For this first episode of the fall 2024 season, I sit down with Maxim Baru. He's a well-known labor organizer here in Montreal who's worked in Iceland and Japan as well. We're going to talk to him about what people can gain through unionizing and how to do it. He's got his most recent project, the General Union, a group which helps workers organize in their workplace to start unions, to try and defend their rights and to get higher wages and better working conditions. Welcome to the Eco Mindset. At a time when the climate is crumbling, inequality is on the rise, and our leaders are beating the drums of war, let's talk about the issues, the solutions, and the power dynamics that got us here. All over the world, people are getting involved. The resistance is growing, and progress is within reach. Join us to discover, to debate, and to learn about the ongoing struggle for the environment, for peace, and for social justice in Quebec, Canada, and around the world. My name is Alex Tyrrell, and I'm your host for this podcast, The Eco Mindset. Hi, everybody. So today I'm with Maxim Baru, and we're here to discuss a little bit about labor organizing in Montreal. Can you tell us a bit about your background and some of the projects that you're involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. Mostly, I help people get a union at their job for the first time, or if there is already a union, help it mobilize and organize and strike better and win more. I've worked for different unions in Quebec and English Canada, as well as the United States and abroad. Previously worked as the head of labor organizing in Iceland's second largest union called Epling. And I've worked as far as Japan and Tokyo, where I worked with a little union called Tozen. So I've tried to kind of gather all sorts of experiences to have try to see sort of the best tactics and strategies from around the world. And most recently, people might have seen me around assisting the strike of the first faculty at McGill University to have ever unionized. Those are the professors of law.
Yes, we had the vice president of that union, Chris Anker, on the podcast just a few episodes ago, Ed.
Exactly. Great. Yeah. And also, they might see me in terms of helping people get a union at their job for the first time through a little indie union project in Montreal called Syndicat Général, or the General Union. And those are two areas that people might have seen me.
Awesome. So there's always some difficulties that people encounter when trying to unionize, and a lot of those difficulties sometimes can come from the employees themselves and their lack of confidence in what unionization would look like and what the advantages and disadvantages are. Can you run us through some of the reasons that it's in the best interest of workers to unionize more or less regardless of what field they're in?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we're seeing nowadays is that the cost of living is increasing, people's rent is increasing, people's wages are stagnating. And what we're really seeing is that a lot of the changes in employment and labor law that have taken place over the years have really put employers into a position where they feel themselves really entitled to demand everything of everyone, where there's no floor to the kind of indignities or the kind of disrespect that people are forced to endure, and that many people are forced to endure rising prices without connection in their rising wages. And so a lot of people are naturally motivated by the situation. People are also seeing in the news that in many areas, the market is doing well. The economy, is people are boasting that there are different segments of the economy that are doing very well, and people want to see their own lives reflected in that general prosperity. They want that shared prosperity. So that's, of course, a huge motivator for people. But in my experience, overwhelmingly, people from across the whole economic spectrum, whether it's very low wage workers or very high wage workers, often people they're not the most animated and inspired by financial issues, although those play a big role, but by respect and dignity issues, and by issues that are, I would call, kind of like workers' control issues. Paul Weiler, who is one of Canada's most famous labor scholars and practitioners in Canadian history, he sort of put it as, described as a very important key exercise in self-governance, that even if nothing were to follow in terms of economic benefits or material benefits, which they often do follow, that exercise in self-management and self-governance with you and your peers at the place where you spend most of your time at your job has benefits spiritually, intellectually, politically that go far beyond any of the simple material gains people make.
Right. So it's about harnessing the power of the people in the workplace in order to advocate for common cause, right? Which is the working conditions. I know, as you're mentioning, in a lot of strikes and a lot of union activity, it's more about the working conditions. Like on the podcast, one of the first episodes, we had a president of a teachers union in Montreal. And that's what she said, was that like the wage issue is one thing. I mean, arguably very important, but also like the size of the classes and like the learning environment and that sort of thing. So a lot of people would think that unions are just about getting higher wages, which is an important part, but it goes far beyond that, I think. And in Montreal, some people would say that Quebec has a bit of a union culture, right? Can you tell us some of the advantages that we have for unionizing here? Because I know that in the case of Amazon, now the Amazon workers at one facility in Laval have formed a union, and they're being the government is forcing Amazon to negotiate because of the legislation. Whereas in the United States, there was also an Amazon workplace that was unionized, but it seems like the employer is not forced to negotiate. So what are the advantages of the Quebec legal framework for unionizing compared to elsewhere?
Yeah, so I would say essentially there are three areas of advantage, or at least apparently at first blush, there's three areas of advantage. One of them is historical, because the labor movement was a big part of Quebec national independence movements in its recent history. They have a kind of credibility, a kind of legitimacy, and they have been sort of embedded into the system of governance and politics and the economy in Quebec in a way that's unique to the rest of North America. And that creates certain political, diplomatic, strategic, and psychological opportunities that other places don't have. Number two is the baseline culture, the culture of people who have grown up in Quebec, who are really acculturated with Quebecois culture. The attitude towards unions are different, but also the attitude towards coworkers. For example, what are your cultural norms of selling out? What are the cultural norms of being in solidarity with your coworkers? There is a big culture that remains in Quebec that sort of anchors people to a sentiment of working class attitudes and working class life. And this feeling that there are certain red lines where you cross from a legitimate, credible, maybe even prosperous working class life into a bourgeois or into a kind of like exploitative area of individualism that is less tolerated than I would say in some areas in North America. And of course, it has all sorts of advantages and disadvantages culturally, but I feel like it's one of the cornerstones that creates conditions in Quebec culturally that give unions a little bit more of an advantage. For example, just give a very small microscopic example. A lot of people comment how in English Canada, there's a lot more indirectness, right? When people are working together on collaborative projects, people are a lot more indirect. People fear that if they critique a project or they give overly direct feedback, then it will be taken badly. People's feelings will be hurt. And of course, this does happen in Quebec too. But my observation, kind of walking the line between these two cultures, it happens a lot less frequently in Quebec. People in Quebec are a lot more direct, and that creates a sort of strategic advantage for them as well. So that's the cultural element.
Right.
And the third area is the labor law. The labor law has certain advantages around, for example, it's easier to apply for, in Quebec, the way it works is if somebody wants to have a government recognized union, the legal protection to engage in union activity, such as a strike, you have to apply for a kind of license from the government. And that process of applying for the license is easier than in other jurisdictions in North America.
Is that because of the method they call the card check? Like if you get more than 50% of the workers to sign a union card, then you're able to apply and receive union status, whereas other places, they might require a referendum of the...
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah. But even more than that, even if you look at the details of like the amount of paperwork that's required to even file the materials, it's much simple. It's much more direct and much simpler than in some other jurisdictions. But the other important piece of it is what's called first contract arbitration. Now, this has all sorts of drawbacks that have been well aired, and we can go into them if you're interested. But in a nutshell, for the first collective agreement, there's this perception that some employers are so undomesticated. They're so dishabituated from collective bargaining process that the government needs to put its thumb on the scale in favor of collective bargaining by obligating the employer to enter into a first collective agreement. And so workers can apply, and actually employers can apply as well, for the Ministry of Labor to appoint an arbitrator, which would look at the circumstances, look at the market, and to basically write the first collective agreement. Again, all sorts of drawbacks with this system, but one of the things that it means is that for overwhelming majority of workplaces, they will get a first collective agreement.
Right.
Whether it's a good one, whether it is going to last more than 6 months after it's established, those are other questions.
Right. So that's what we can expect to happen with Amazon in Laval then.
I think so. Of course, there's going to be these judicial debates that Amazon is going to engage with. I'm not sure exactly what the latest news is. I know that Amazon was even trying to go so far as saying the whole Quebec labor code that enables card check certification is unconstitutional. Yeah. Where that's all going to end up, I'm not really sure. I'm sure that, at certain, like all judicial processes, at a certain level of political sensitivity, they become matters of government, matters of intergovernmental affairs, matters of international trade. And I'm sure for a company like Amazon, they're going to pull every lever they have with, those kind of on those political levels, and what judges will rule with respect to whether it is unconstitutional or whether different aspects of the labor code that are going to potentially force Amazon to reach a first collective agreement are going to be in place. I'm sure it's going to be very political. There's going to be a lot of discussions, probably at the highest levels, but that's just a guess. But more challenging thing is, of course, companies closing. Right. This may very well prevent them reaching a first collective agreement. We've had many cases.
Right. We had some stuff like that. A historic case in Quebec would be the closure of the Walmart in Jonquière. Right. As soon as they unionized, the company closed the Walmart, but they were forced to settle and compensate the employees for an amount that was not disclosed like many years afterwards.
Exactly.
But it does show that, there is a certain legal standard that the companies have to respect. And I would hope that Amazon wouldn't succeed in making any new legal precedents against unions by their efforts in this. And I would think that there's probably other corporations that have tried to challenge the constitutionality of these laws before, but maybe with all of Amazon's money and legal resources, they could find some new aspects to challenge.
Yeah, they could always find new aspects to challenge. One of the things there's been a lot of evolution in the way the Supreme Court of Canada has reinterpreted people's freedom of association, from which all union rights in Canada flow, essentially. There's no, in the Canadian, effectively, Constitution, there's no right to a union or right to strike in and of itself.
The Constitution is so vague. Right. They list their rights, but there's
exactly right. It's like derivative from freedom of association, and that's changed drastically in the recent years. It's mostly changed in favor of labor unions and in favor of workers, and to broaden their rights and to protect those rights further. But what will happen in a changing political landscape, a changing international labor market aspect?
Right. And potentially a changing Supreme Court also.
Changing Supreme Court, a changing federal government. Yeah. I suspect that Amazon, I would be surprised if Amazon were to be able to make such a grand impact on Quebec and Canadian laws. Probably they'll try to use their leverage in terms of their ability to threaten to leave Quebec.
Right. I mean, could Amazon really afford to leave Quebec, though, with all the money that they're making here?
I would have thought no, but after Facebook and Google started to turn the screws on Canada for the new media law, where Facebook is the company that owns Facebook and Instagram, is blocking links to news media for now going on quite a long time, which is something I did
completely absurd.
Yeah, completely absurd. Now it's like, to me, it's like everything is on the table. But I don't think that that should impede anybody. The reality is we have to try. The reality is the labor movement across Canada has to stand together and in a united front to hold the line. And we have to hold the line that if you don't accept the principle that workers have the right to associate and to negotiate and to fight for their working conditions and to defend themselves, then you don't have any business doing business in Canada.
Right. And Amazon itself, is embedding itself here in the shipping industry, right? And they're taking over territory from Canada Post, which was done by unionized workers. So it's like we have almost like a second mail system happening through Amazon that's not unionized. So I think that's unfortunate. It's too bad that, Canada Post is losing all of these, all the letter mail, right? But they're not really picking it up that much in terms of parcels. They're not as quick as Amazon and that sort of thing. So there was a lot of attacks on the mail system, right, by Stephen Harper and stuff like that. They put the prices up. They made it less competitive and we're sort of trying to kill it, right? So that's a bit unfortunate. I want to talk to you about the General Union project that you're involved in, and I checked on the website, and it says that you guys are a grassroots union and that you help people achieve union status. Can you tell us a bit about that organization?
Yeah, so it's a little project that myself and some folks put together just a couple of years ago. And the idea is to take sort of the best of what we're seeing in the established union movement and fuse it with tactics that have been effective from the more activist grassroots movement that we've seen in Montreal, with the aim of helping people get a union at their job for the first time, especially in enterprises in the private sector that are small or medium sized or that are really splintered across different companies and different employers, where a lot of large establishment unions have a lot of trouble sort of being agile enough to tackle those kinds of employers.
Okay.
And so for the most part, we put together a little volunteer team of people who have experience at labor unions, people who are have experience or current experience at different labor unions, and people who just want to learn, people who want to learn the ropes of how to do labor organizing. There are very few organizations in Montreal where a person could put up their hand and learn the tools of the trade, as it were, the A to Z of helping someone get a union at their job. A lot of leftist organizations talk about the importance of unions, both historically and today, in making transformative social change, leveraging the power of workers as a group in Canada to make social transformation, but vanishingly few actually give people opportunity to roll up their sleeves and try it out. And so primarily what it is it's a group of people who team up to connect with people who want a union at their job already and help them walk through the A to Z of setting that up and setting up the union where they would be sort of in charge of what they're doing.
So it's interesting. So you talked a little bit about the sort of union world establishment. I assume that you're talking about the CSN and FTQ and the larger unions.
All of the unions that are sort of long-standing and are the predominant incumbent players, sort of, if we could call it a union market, the marketplace of labor unions.
Right. And so when people come to your group, as I saw on the website, you're encouraging people to take appointments to find out about unionizing in their workplace. Do you recommend that those newly formed unions affiliate with something like the CSN, or do you prefer or advise them to stay independent?
So we tip at the initial sort of the foundational option, we just suggest they affiliate with the general union, and it's really just a shell for them to have a structure. One of the things that is a little bit annoying about Quebec law is that you as a group of people, let's say you're working at a cafe or you're working at a bookstore, you as a group of people, it's not very easy to go to the government and ask for the license. You already have to have a union, and that union asks for the license. It's a very silly bureaucratic step that personally I think is the only thing that flows from it is to slow down and act as a speed bump for this process. You need to have a constitution. You need to be able to collect dues. You need to be able to have specific union leaders. You need to have an address. And those are things that, a group, like an ordinary group of people may not want to jump through all of those hurdles before they want to act to defend themselves against something urgent happening at their job. So it's kind of a shell and a structure. There is know-how amongst people, so people can kind of use that structure to apply for the license that would be held by the general union, and they get advice, but ultimately they're in the cockpit of their own organizing and what they want to do. And they go from there. In Quebec, it's very easy to switch unions. Anytime there is not a collective agreement, people can sign new union membership cards and switch unions with their preference. And we always encourage people to shop around and find out what's best for them. But at the very sort of foundational ground level, we want to make it as easy as possible. And here's a shell and a structure with knowledgeable people where someone who wants to unite their job can rapidly get integrated and get equipped with the social skills they need to build that union social structure at their job, and not need to worry about all of the stack of legal paperwork that is necessary.
Right. So let's say somebody is working in a restaurant and they got bad working conditions and low wages. What would be the first step for somebody, one individual out of this workplace to start a union?
Yeah. So, of course, we always recommend people to talk to someone knowledgeable, either someone from our team or another union, to kind of get the lay of the land. And there's really two sort of phases of the approach to establishing a union. One of them is legal. So people begin the process of signing union cards. Like you had mentioned earlier, this is going to sound really silly, but for people to demonstrate, to get the right to collectively take action in Canada and in Quebec, they have to prove to the government, like a miniature referendum, that they really want that a majority of people really want that. And the way they do that in Quebec is by signing union cards that prove that a majority of current employees want to do that.
Right.
So that process begins, but that process is secondary to the social structure, which is basically beginning to systematically, deliberately, thoughtfully bring people in and convince them of the merits of collective action. So that is, begin to talk to coworkers one-on-one outside of the workplace using specific conversation techniques that we can help people get a grasp of, where they build a team that can look at the problems, convert the problems to specific demands, build action plans that use pressure tactics against the employer to get what they need, and then to defend what they've won. So that building that social structure is a huge and the most important part of this process. So the very first steps that any union that has credibility will tell people is, let's begin by building the social structure. Who do you know? Make a list of your coworkers, begin making relationships with them. And this is, by the way, one of the things that people find very rewarding, whether or not the process of unionization succeeds or not. It's sad to say, but in Quebec and in a lot of Canada, there's a culture of, have you ever seen the show Severance? Right?
No,
the premise of this TV show is that people have a microchip in their brain, and when they go to work, they don't remember their outside life. And when they are on the outside, they don't remember what they do at work.
Oh.
And but it sounds dystopian and sci-fi, but in reality, it's commentary on something that I think is very real happening in North America, which is people have this compartmentalized view of their work. They go to work, they superficially have a relationship with their colleagues. They don't make friends with their colleagues outside of work. They, even at jobs that have a lot of prestige attached to them, even email jobs where people have a lot of availability to get to know their coworkers, they clock in and they clock out. And we don't know our coworkers. There are many people who don't say hi to each other. There are many people who are just very superficially know each other. And so this process, the very first, most important process of building the union, of getting to know each other, who are our coworkers?
Yeah.
Where do they live? What do they like? Do they have kids? Do they have a dog? Do they like hockey? Who are they? What are their real life concerns? Say hi to them, look them in the eye, go get a coffee with them.
Yeah. And I guess those things can change a lot depending on what kind of workplace, what kind of people work there, and just a random factor too of personalities and that sort of thing, political views, right? Some workplaces might be more right wing than others, right?
Absolutely, yeah. But one of the things that we found consistent throughout many workplaces, whether there's sort of more right wing elements to them or left wing elements to them, is that on the terrain of everyday life at work, there is a certain rule that predominates, which is there are people who give orders and there's other people who take orders. And that when the people who are chronically in the position of always taking orders, they know very viscerally, regardless of what their larger politics are, that there's a power dynamic at play, right? And that they are in this sort of subordinated position, and they would like to be in a less subordinated position. People would like more respect. One of the things we see most commonly, even in jobs, that have a little bit more stability, that require degrees to get the job, or people should be more pleased. Often what we find is management, a small group of people, management unilaterally take decisions. And a lot of the people who are on the front line of the company, even if they're programmers, they feel that management is not taking the best decisions on behalf of the company. They're the ones who are meeting with clients. They're the ones who are working with the tools, whatever the tools may be, whether they're digital or physical, material or social. They're the ones that are seeing the terrain. They're the ones that are liaising with the organization or the company's partners and so on. And the information that they're learning is not transmitted to management in an effective way where they have a seat at the table to direct the company's policies. They actually want their company to succeed. Often, actually, even extremely workers that are very precarious, they want their company to succeed. And they feel frustrated that management is not taking what they perceive as rational decisions from a strictly even business perspective. And so one of the things that animates people to unionize is to have that seat at the table and like yank a little bit the levers of control of the company so they can have it succeed better. So it's not just succeeding from a strictly, the perspective of a small group of people, but has the whole company's benefit, that has the whole company's positive success in mind.
I've seen a lot of auto workers, for example, like pressuring the big automakers to do, more electric vehicles and that kind of thing, and to sort of change with the times. But it is true, right, that, usually if you work for somewhere, you want that business to succeed. And, we're on an environmental podcast, so I wanted to ask you about, some of the different times that unionization can somewhat work against the environmental movement, like in terms of unions of like pipeline builders or tar sands exploitation, oil companies, and that sort of thing. I was wondering what your opinions are on some of those things.
Yeah. So for the most part, I think that people want to see positive environmental change. Even people who you notice are really conservative and don't really believe in climate change, as you and I might see it, they want, their line is often, we want clean water. We want clean air. We want, we don't want toxic chemicals in our environment. And the people who are working those jobs that you just described, they're the first ones to face personal health consequences from the work they're doing, and their families are the ones that are on the front line of facing health hazards. For example, there was an expose, I remember just a few years ago, I think it was in Toronto Star, about workers who are transporting oil products, and it's just transported in trucks, and it turns out oil is radioactive. I don't know if a lot of people know that. I didn't know that. And so the article was describing how workers are carrying measuring tools for radioactivity, and they're scanning themselves and writing it down because they know they will have cancers and they want to be able to prove later compensation for themselves. But they're working this job now knowing full well they're getting sick. And so they would love to have leverage that transition their work from something less personally hazardous. How much, more can you want a green transition than you yourself not wanting to get cancer from the job you're doing? But there is sometimes a lack of leverage. That lack of leverage can originate from many different areas. And in the meantime, what are we doing with folks?
So I went up to see the tar sands back in 2019, right? And in the city of Fort McMurray, like everybody, well, not everybody, a lot of people in Canadian politics and the oil is like, oh, great jobs, like in the oil patch and all that. But then I get up there, the entire town stinks like oil. And when you get even closer to the work sites, you have these huge refineries pumping out all of these emissions and everything. They had like a barracks, like right there. So people are working probably like 12 hours a day on like the oil field or in the refinery, and then they're sleeping like on site, like next to all this polluted air, and like they might have air filters in there or something, I don't even know. But it seemed to me that those jobs were not that good, and even if they're paying people in their 20s $100,000 a year to go out there, the people are coming back with health problems and also with social problems, right? It's a fly in, fly out sort of job and environment, right? So there's a lot of social consequences for that kind of thing. And, the approach of the Green Party, at least for workers like that, whether it be in the weapons industry or in the automotive industry or in fossil fuels, is that those people should be given a job guarantee in the energy transition. And I think that some people in the environmental movement tend to point the finger at the workers in these industries. And honestly, sometimes those workers are advocating for their industries and for, the continuation of fossil fuels and that sort of thing. But if, a government could offer them a job guarantee, I think it would eliminate a lot of the worker and union opposition to the energy transition. And in the end, it's not those workers who are responsible for where we're at and everything, right? It's the corporate greed and everything, that capitalism that pushed us to this limit. And, the fact that people are desperate enough to have to go and work in the oil patch to begin with and leave their families behind and go and breathe this dirty, disgusting air, shows a certain amount of desperation.
Absolutely. We can't look at this, I think, in a way that's disconnected from the impact on Canada's manufacturing capacity and Canada's labor market that was the consequence of the various free trade agreements and consequence of our political decisions starting in the 1980s that hollowed out mass employment industries in Canada. The reality is that, we look at the latest Stats Canada numbers. Some of the last ones I saw were people, even with university degrees, there's pretty much one job for every two job seekers. And then talking about even mass employment industries, they're not here, right? They're in Mexico, they're in China, they're in Poland, they're in various other places far flung around the world. And the reality is that for a lot of people, there are just no jobs, or the jobs that are worth having are so degrading that they're so beneath the dignity of an adult that has any self-respect that people don't want to do them at those prices, don't want to do them under those conditions. And a lot of the areas that people go to work in that region, they're not all from that region. Many of them are not from there at all. Maybe they're not even from Canada, but even from within Canada, there's a lot of people who are coming from areas that have been hard hit by deindustrialization in Canada. So there's not an alternative employment for them, and they grow up. By now, this deindustrialization has been a fact, a reality in Canada for so long that people have been born where they haven't known anything but a deindustrialized Canada. And so when you look around the prospects and all you see are crummy service jobs around you, or working at some factory putting together pieces of plastic where you are paid almost nothing and you are completely disrespected, what are you going to do? And a lot of those people actually to get the training that you need to work those machines in Alberta, the process you go through, the people you meet, you get to become a specialist almost in a certain kind of job. It brings you self-respect. It brings you the kind of money that you can live as a dignified adult. And as a dignified citizen of the country, you get to, in a sense, have a place in society. And it's not without training and without experience. So until this is got to be a whole of market approach. It's not just even about, although I agree with you, it's got, as part of the green transition, we need to be able to give people something. We can't just say, well, now your industry is wiped out. And this is something that Canada has done again and again. So if we judge the future prospects by historical actions, Canada has wiped out numerous industries just wantonly. So there's that, but there's also just addressing the industrialization of Canada in general. If we're going to have a population that is reaching 40 million people, then we need to have places where people can be employed en masse and places where people can be employed in a dignified way, both financially and socially. So this is a huge part of it. And of course, like I said, for the workers, if this is, from their perspective, the surest, most firm way to a dignified job as an adult, given where their starting point is in life, given the resources and opportunities that they have in life, then they have every right to defend that place in their society, because what are we going to do? Am I going to give them another job? Or are you going to, so that's one thing. For the unions of these workers, they have a person elected to the head of that union. If that person doesn't even you remotely represent the interests of the members, that person will be voted out.
Exactly. Yeah.
But more than that too, there is also like a cultural element to all of this, right? A lot of propaganda, anti-worker, anti-union, anti-organizing propaganda is highly and densely concentrated at Alberta. And so people who are most intimately implicated in these processes, in my experience, often are the victims of a lot of propaganda. They're the ones that are working with machines and suffering the healthcare consequences most immediately, and they know that. So they actually know much more than environmentally oriented people who are very disconnected on the other side of the country. On the other hand, in terms of, let's say, the bank of ideas of what's possible, what changes could be made, who can make them, what is their true leverage in society to make changes on behalf of themselves, that sometimes I feel like they're victims of a lot of propaganda.
Right. Propaganda to disempower people.
The propaganda to disempower them and from
knowing how much potential there is, right? They have that huge oil industry.
Exactly.
Parts of it are unionized, but there's many subcontractors and all kinds of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you have governments bailing out pipeline companies and so on, essentially you are creating this unfair fight. It's not just workers versus an employer, and then it's a playing field between them. It's also the government that puts their thumb on the scale behind the employer financially and diplomatically, politically, and that makes it a very unfair fight, right?
Just like the different times that we've seen back to work legislation for CN and different orders like that.
Yeah, and we've seen that repeatedly. Alberta has had governments that are very anti-union in the sense that they make it more complicated to get a union and to use a union effectively. Right. And we've seen, again, to come back to this cultural element, in Alberta, some folks, there's like a family tradition of voting conservative. And it's not, you can have a conversation with folks where they'll talk about how there's not enough government stimulus. They'll talk about how there's not enough government programs. They'll talk about that they're upset about the removal of certain government programs that used to be there. But there is this sentiment that it's the family line to vote conservative. I'm not saying that's, I don't want to paint that with an overly broad brush. That's not everybody.
Well, no, because they've had NDP governments as well in Alberta, but have invested a little bit more in schools and education and healthcare. But then, it never lasted more than one mandate, and it's like back to conservative again. Actually, I was out there campaigning for the Green Party in the election last spring. The one before, actually. But it's a lot of people seem to think that like that oil industry is the only way forward. It brings so much money and all that. And any criticism of that is a criticism of the Albertan way of life and that sort of thing. So I think as you mentioned, there is a lot of propaganda and avoiding sort of like class consciousness. The government and the industry don't want people to know what they can achieve if they were to push things a little bit harder. Just to pivot back to Quebec, one tool that we have to defend workers' rights is the CNESST. I used it once before when I was a teenager. I worked at Subway, and I got that job. I did about 3 shifts, and I found a better job somewhere else, so I left. And the boss told me, well, you just did the training. I'm not going to pay you. So I called up the CNSST at age 15, and they forced him to pay.
Amazing.
So it was nice to see that even though it was like a small amount of money, like $100 or something, that the government would go and force the employer to pay me. I thought that was nice. But then a few years later, I had a friend who was in the massage industry, and she had some problems with the employer. So I said, let's give the CNSST a call and see what they can do for you. They said, massage workers, wait a second, whole different game, because technically they're self-employed because they're renting the room and that sort of thing. So it's like on contract. So it was interesting to see that not everybody is as well defended by the CNSST. And it's dependent on which industry you're in and that sort of thing. I was very surprised to see that, the same basic conditions that are in there, like having a minimum 3 or 4 hour shift. If you show up, you're paid for that amount of time. You can't they're like, oh no, massage therapy, you can show up oh, the client canceled, well, forget it, go home, you're not getting paid anything, and that sort of thing. So what are some of the weaknesses of, this government-funded workers' protection through CNESST?
Yeah, so the weaknesses go deep and wide. The reality is that it's faced chronic underfunding and a lot of very conservative leadership over many years. For example, even if you just go on the website to file a complaint, you'll notice that the website looks like, it could have been from 1999 in some of its aspects.
Okay.
So it's even just on the level of user friendliness, and then further onto the level of like, how do the problems get remedied? How quickly do they get remedied? What are the tools that agency has to enforce the law? The reality is that almost entirely they are dependent on the voluntary collaboration of the employers. And they do have certain tools to force employers, but they work really slowly. Recently, we had a case where a company conducted a mass firing, and as per Quebec rules, they're supposed to pay people a certain length of severance in the context of what's called a collective dismissal, where you're firing over a certain amount of people within a certain short time frame. We discovered that the company violated this law, and we helped individual workers file complaints at the CNESST, and the reaction was, to put it mildly, very dissatisfying to a lot of people. The follow-up was very uninformative. There was some skepticism towards people, even though there was documents showing what was going on. And even when the CNESST decided, okay, yes, we think that the company did break the law, the process, they're very uncommunicative. The process is really slow. They said, we'll call, maybe this will take 6 months, or maybe you'll get your money next year. And they tried to first phone the company. They tried to get their voluntary cooperation.
Right.
And the process was very dissatisfying, even though we had very clear, this is not like a social violation of a norm, which maybe, there's a he said, she said type of situation about disrespect.
It's like a clear case
of what around wages. And there's many elements like that. And it's sort of baked into the system that employment norms, which is what the CNESST is supposed to govern and administer, are very weak. The Canadian economy, the current sort of model that we work on, that was really developed and fleshed out around World War II, it was set under the assumption that the key industries are unionized, that adults work in the core sector of the economy, mostly men, around World War II, and they're unionized, and that because of the laws around collective agreements, that's what primarily protects people and people's conditions. And employment law, as one judge famously said it in Canada, is like labor law's little sister. It was designed to protect women who are working part-time for pocket money. Of course, this is absurd and ridiculous and never really even truly faithfully characterized the labor market. But it was closer to what the labor market looked like when the system was set up. Now we have a complete inversion where very few industries are unionized. It's almost entirely in the public sector. The private sector, if we don't do something to reverse the trend and decline of unions, we're going to be talking about it as a historical artifact, something in a museum that used to be important and now is just like a historical concept. That is unionism in the private sector.
Right.
And most people depend on employment norms as a basis of protection, but they are inherently, from their very foundation, incredibly weak in Canada.
Interesting. Would you say that you mentioned there might be a decline in union membership?
Absolutely, yeah. Overall, the trajectory in union density in Canada has followed the same trajectory as that of the United States. Not as rapidly, but
And that's a negative trend.
That's a negative trend.
Really?
And this is David Dorey just mentioned this, I believe it was last year at major lecture at the University of Toronto. David Dorey is one of the most well-respected and well-regarded labor scholars in Canada. His book around labor law is like the book around labor law that a lot of people refer to. He pointed out that unless a major transformation happens in the Canadian industrial relations system, that private sector collective bargaining will become something that is discussed in purely historical terms in the not distant future.
Wow. And what would you say is driving that?
Well, there's a lot of different elements. Some of those elements are inherent to the complexion and composition of the labor market, the way companies operate, people's cultural backgrounds as well, people's cultural assumptions around unions. But a lot of that has to do as well with the fact that the foundations of our union licensing and operating and regulating system has not been updated in many years, or the way it's been updated has been ineffective. And so the system, it was designed around the World War II to basically work at large established factories where thousands of people are concentrated there, where the effort to mount this miniature referendum that we discussed earlier, right, where people prove to the government that they want to negotiate with their boss, they want to have labor rights, and then to go on strike, it has far reaching consequences for those workers and the community, because it's a giant factory where the whole community depends on this factory. Whereas now we have a lot of small employers. Often the employers are fissured into different legal entities that employ part of the workforce and shuffle them around. And our whole union licensing and regulating system is confounded by the way corporations structure themselves these days and by the composition of the labor market. Then, of course, we have these international trade agreements, which give employers a lot of latitude to simply leave the country or to shift around their productive processes between Canada and the United States, especially for jobs that require, they're mostly computer jobs, where there's not like a physical mechanism that's here. So those elements. But we have to also be taking stock of the fact that labor unions do have some complicity in the situation, which is that there's been a kind of path of least resistance taken. The path of least resistance is public sector unionism, that it's stable employment, it's generally well-remunerated employment. That means union dues can be quite high. And so a lot of unions have kind of leaned into public sector unionism. So most of the membership, overwhelmingly majority of membership of unions in Canada is in the public sector. And part of it is also the dynamics of negotiations, right? The government is less can be sometimes less agile in taking anti-worker action. Of course, when they do take it, it can be draconian with special laws that break strikes, or reorganizing gigantic labor markets, as Quebec is doing now in healthcare. But for the most part, a private sector employer can act with great speed and great agility to intimidate people. And so part of that is that, and part of it has been a fear of or a risk aversion to spending money on organizing new industries that have previously not been organized. And this is shifting. There are more unions that are beginning to reinvest in organizing and to reinvest in organizing amongst public sector unionism. For example, a lot of your audience might be aware of Jane McAlevey, who is probably the most famous labor organizer. Unfortunately, she just passed away. And she kind of popularized this idea of the organizing model. And that is like relying on people power and not exclusively negotiations behind closed doors to make change and to make unions successful. And so a lot of unions, including the public sector, are beginning to adopt her model and are seeing wins. And part of that is there is a piece of this which is re-encouraging unionism in the private sector as well, but it can cost a lot of money if you're purely running unionization efforts with highly paid staff. It can be really expensive, really time consuming. Companies might be small. And so, like we talked about with this miniature referendum, if the consequence of this effort only hits the four corners of a very small enterprise, then you feel like your efforts are not wide reaching or not far reaching.
Right.
And so one of the things that I think is necessary is more sectoral unionism. That is, unions that go beyond just the singular enterprise that they're going after, because it's the cost to benefit of going after a constellation of microscopic enterprises is just not there for people. Right. And so we need to think bigger. We need to think of going after multiple employers and whole sectors, as has shown to hold the line better in terms of working conditions and the political power of workers in the European Union.
Right. So to have larger groups of people unionized. Like, I know that there was a push to have like couche-tard dépanneurs unionized, but it was sort of like one store at a time.
Right. And the reality is that we may need to do that. And in fact, here's a funny thing. And this speaks to union strategy. the reality is that labor law, major transformations, political transformations in the legislation surrounding labor law, they don't appear to be on the immediate horizon. And so I think that unions are going to have to look in-house and ask ourselves, how do we change our movement from within in our strategies and our tactics to essentially implement the kind of changes we want to see legislatively. So let me just give you an example of what I mean. On the one hand, we could wait for the government to pass a law that says we're going to allow unions to negotiate and to fight for an entire sector, for example, all hotels or all restaurants. And we could wait for that, but it doesn't seem to be in the offing.
So we would need a legislative change.
I think that would be one possibility. But Japan offers another version of it. So Japan has fundamentally at its core the same labor relations model as Canada. It was based on what's called the Wagner Act, which is the foundational labor law in the United States, because the United States occupied Japan during World War II. They effectively implemented the same labor relations model, but they have applied certain strategies that have overcome some of its inadequacies. They noticed in the 1950s, so pretty soon after it was implemented, that this model of enterprise unionism, where we go one business at a time, means that people lack leverage. And so what they started doing was implementing this idea called shunto, where every spring, they call it the spring offensive. Every year, unions will do research on what are the key demands that we should fight for, and they will transmit that amongst each other. And so all unions fight for, they fight for many local issues, but at minimum, they fight for a specific set of issues.
Right.
And by doing so, they kind of generate a sectoral union movement, not by law, but by their own efforts, by their own collaboration. The system has declined in Japan for a number of reasons, but when it was in place, it was very effective. And this is something that is very possible in Canadian unions. We can look laterally to all unions in Canada, our colleagues, and look at, do an analysis of what are the common issues. For example, we all need raises in wages. We all need raises in workers' control of companies where we work, both public sector and private sector. And we could say this year, this spring, this fall, these are our minimum demands. We're going for it. And we're calling, and we saw a little bit of this.
And hopefully then a general strike if they don't get it, right?
Exactly. And so what we saw an example of this a little bit in 2016 with the fight for the $15 minimum wage, where I thought it was an interesting little example of comparison. In Ontario, the campaigner on the $15 minimum wage seemed to me to be very prefabricated, very canned, we're going to do a press conference, we're going to do a speech. But in Quebec, there were unions, individual union locals, like at a old folks home, in the old port of Montreal, at a university, where people were putting the demand for $15 an hour as the minimum wage into their collective agreement and going on strike behind that demand. And so it created this really interesting moment of harmonization between different unions at different sectors, all pulling in the same direction.
Right.
So I do think that movement didn't get enough uptake that it needed to really succeed. But I thought it was an interesting episode of, in a sense, a sectoral union togetherness approach that we don't need to wait for legislative change to make that happen. We can choose to make that happen.
Interesting. And I thought it was interesting what you mentioned about the decline in private sector unions. And I can just imagine if that trend were to continue, given what everybody's facing with inflation, the price of housing and food costs and that sort of thing. It's unfortunate because, especially with the private sector, the companies put up the price of their merchandise to reflect inflation,
right?
But they did not put up the wages to go with it. So you think about it like a construction worker who's working for even a small contractor. Well, the contractor is going to charge more for the job, right? Because the market for that is higher,
right?
But the market for labor has not necessarily responded nearly as quickly as the prices that the companies are charging, right?
Exactly.
So if this trend were to continue, it could further degrade the average working conditions of your average person.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think there's everything you just said is right on. And I think there's another very important element to this, which is sort of the enforcement of the basic standards of work and the work safety and health standards that we've come to rely on and think of as a basic minimum for a country like Canada. And what I mean is that like legislatures throughout Canada, they'll pass laws, and they'll, health and safety laws around, the right to disconnect, or whatever we have come to expect and want to see.
Mhm.
But how are they going to be enforced, right? You're a lawmaker and a particular legislator, you pass a law, everyone's really happy, but then who's going to go to company XYZ and make
Right.
them do it?
Just like for environmental regulations.
Exactly, right? And
Yeah.
who's going to make them do it? The people who are employed there. They're the ones that see firsthand what's going on, and they're the ones that the employer depends on to make the productivity of the company a success, to
Mhm.
make its projects a success. They're the ones who can respond with agility and effectiveness to enforce the laws that you want to pass. That, in fact, in a sense, they want to, right? They elect you with a mandate. They want to see these laws passed, and they are, but it ultimately depends on people at the point of their productive lives to enforce whatever we
Yeah.
want. And by the way, we can see this over and over again. Even, for example, when we look at reviews of labor law review exercises in Canada, so different provinces and at the federal level, every so often governments will review labor laws and they'll say, do we need to update them? They almost entirely depend on the voluntary participation of the employers.
Right.
They will not pass a law that employers are radically against. So what does that mean? If we want to see transformational change, even at the most basic level, it will require full cooperation and maximum rights to workers to use concerted activity, that is activism on the job, to enforce what we wanted to see change in society.
Yeah.
And so it's not going to be enough under any circumstances for people just to be politically active in an electoral sense, although that's important. We should do it. But every political party should have in mind the labor unions. The labor unions are the ones that are going to be enforcing the social changes they see.
And the CNESST also should be more adequately funded to be able to defend these people. It's similar, like we had talked about the constitutional right to freedom of assembly, right? And when they adopted the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada, it came along with funding for a court challenges program, because they knew that just putting the rights in the Constitution doesn't mean that much. It's like the judgments and the legal precedents that's created by it. So the government was funding cases that were, doing charter challenges. What's similar with like labor laws, right? Like you can put these labor laws and say, okay, the minimum wage is going to be this much, but then if an employer is paying less than minimum wage, there has to be an enforcement mechanism.
Exactly.
And like for unionized workers is one thing, but for the people who are not unionized, the CNSST has to be properly funded to be able to address.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. And we can see other models that work really effectively. One of the most problematic things about the Canadian employment standard system, and as well in Quebec, is that it's a complaint-based system. People have to complain. So for example, this company that I mentioned, that did a collective dismissal and it blatantly violated the law in terms of what people were to be compensated, people have to put their name in a complaint against the company, and that name is not anonymous. So therefore, if they want to continue to work in that sector, they may face blacklisting and so on, even to protect their basic rights. And we can see, in contrast, for example, countries like Iceland, there are many problems with their system, and we can go on about them. But as an example, it's not exclusively a complaint-based system, but you will actually have inspectors that go into the workplaces spontaneously, without announcement, without prior announcement. They come into the workplace. They often and they're not just government agents. They're representative of the unions. They're union employees of people who are unionized. They show up at the workplace and they have like an iPad. They're often accompanied by people, let's say, from the tax authority or even the police sometimes. And they can ask you, like, you as a worker, what's your social insurance number? And they can ask you what the working conditions of the company. Is the company obeying the collective agreement and so on and so forth? They can issue, citations to various companies. They can begin processes against them. So they're not
like a labor squad, eh?
Like a labor squad. And
it's funny because like in a restaurant environment, you'd have food inspectors that come in and they inspect the food, but it would be interesting if there were labor inspectors that came in and inspect the conditions and ask people, are you getting paid minimum wage?
Absolutely.
Because there could be a lot of workers under the table and stuff like that. Maybe some people who are here on asylum claims or that sort of thing that are not being paid the minimum wage.
Absolutely.
Even though it's so low.
Absolutely, yeah. There's just... Right now, we're in a situation where there's just rampant violations of the most basic labor norms and the most basic ethical standards that people feel Canada should live up to.
Yeah.
And There's no reason. There's nothing like we can see other like even for people who are conservatively oriented, there's obviously nothing wrong with other market economies that are succeeding. That are very wealthy societies that are able to have a different system, right?
Mhm.
If you agree that a certain health and safety regulation should be something that is the minimum in Canada, that people, then you should be in support of creating systems that enable them to be properly effectuated.
Yeah.
And this complaint-based system that we have is radically inadequate.
Right. And I would assume that even when people do complain, maybe they could get what's owed to them, but not necessarily punitive damages.
Oh, exactly.
And
Absolutely.
no fines for the employer and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And that's like a very far reaching problem is lack of consequences for employers that break the law, both for labor norms, but even labor law.
Yeah.
The reality is that the remedies that people get if they're fired in the course of organizing, or if there's other kinds of essentially psychological harassment or whatever they face in the course of organizing, the remedies that the Administrative Labor Tribunal, which is the organization that administers the labor code of the process of unionization, the remedies are often very slow and very weak.
Mhm.
And so more than ever, we have to be based on people power, the power of people to mobilize and get justice for themselves on the job. And that's one of the things that with the General Union Project, we really want to emphasize to people and help people learn those skills, not just to become dependent on union organizers from the rear who are at some office far away from them, but to pick up the skills that they can defend themselves on the job in a rapid and effective way and get the justice they need. Not that legal tools aren't important. They are important. We need them. But the real leverage under today's conditions are going to come from them on the job.
Right. So what I get from this is it's time for a crackdown.
It's time
on these employers, both from the government legislative side through the enforcement, and also workers themselves cracking down on these employers with bad conditions and low wages and organizing. I wanted to ask you one final question. Mm-hmm. Why is now an important time for people to organize?
Yeah. So one of the most basic facts we mentioned before, like rising cost of living. So there's objective material situations that are creating the conditions where people might want to increase their wages. Now is the time to do it. In some ways, there's more discussion, by the way, of industrial policy. Mm-hmm. Recently, there was an article in the Financial Times that talked about it was cataloging even just the sheer quantity of industrial policy discussions and interventions conducted by governments, including the United States. So we're entering this phase where governments are becoming are returning to a phase of more directly intervening in the economy in a lot of different ways. So there's going to be collective decisions of far-reaching consequences that are now going to be impacting people. And the question is, do you want to have a seat at that table? Mm-hmm. Do you want a piece of that prosperity that's going to be coming as a consequence of returning to an era of industrial policy versus, every little company doing something janky and random. So that's one of the elements. But another one is sociocultural. Since I noticed 2018, something shifted in the United States where unions started to become cool again. It became cool again to do labor organizing. Of course, it's not as far-reaching as we would like, but it started to create something. It became much easier for people to say yes to a union. And we've seen increasing unionization, not just the big, really flashy ones like Amazon and Starbucks, but even in smaller places. And by small, I might mean a few thousand people, right, rather than tens of thousands of people that are less well reported on, but that we're seeing them bloom throughout the country, and where people are really finding their power again. And this movement has, like a lot of things come to Canada from the United States with a little bit of a delay, and it is coming to Canada. More people are excited about it. A lot of young people are excited about unionism. People's perspective about unions is shifting. People's, let's say, their willingness to apathetically suffer an inferior caliber of trade unionism is not holding. People are willing to look around for independence in their union. People want to have true support. People are not just wanting unions that phone it in. They want unions that are willing to put money and people behind them. And people don't just want to enter into a collective agreement and fall asleep. They want to fight. And it's even taken some unions by surprise, where before their members would have wanted the union to solve problems exclusively with legalistic negotiations behind closed doors. And now their members are surprising them by wanting to strike and by feeling like they didn't get as much as they could have had they gone on strike. And a lot of people now are craving, some kind of rebalancing of the equation in society. There is something very out of balance in the social contract in Canada. And
increasingly so.
And so there's something sociocultural here. And this moment, like this window of time is not, may not last forever. We don't know how long it will last. So this is the time to use this opportunity where your coworkers, they may be more open to a union than they had been 5 years ago.
Yeah.
So now is the time to have those conversations with coworkers.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you very much for your perspective. They're very interesting to see all these kind of things, and also to inspire people, right, to take action and stand up for their own working conditions and to think collectively. I thank you so much for the work that you're doing. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation.
Thank you for having me on.
Well, that concludes this episode of the Eco Mindset Podcast. I hope that you enjoyed this interview and that it gave you some ideas about how people, including yourself, can go about unionizing your workplaces to get better conditions, better wages, and a more fair working environment. If you liked this episode and you want us to cover more labor-related content, please leave a comment underneath the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe. We'll be back with lots of amazing content in this season.